everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for episode 9 of season 2 of Revise and Resubmit. I'm Dr. Kim Bissell, the Southern Progress Endowed Professor in Magazine Journalism and the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Communication and Information Sciences at the University of Alabama.
And I'm Dr. Annalisa Volin, an Assistant Professor in the Department of Communication Studies, also at the University of Alabama. And we both work in the Institute for Communication and Information Research, or the ICIR, at UA. So, Kim, one of the things that we have talked a lot about over the course of our episodes and with many of our Revise and Resubmit guests is who the participants are in the various research studies that the faculty are involved in. We've talked about the recruitment of participants. We've talked about the substance of research that our guests are involved in. And one of the things that we haven't yet talked about, but will today, is really sensitive research areas. And what I mean by that is research where you as a participant might think, whoa, do I want to answer that?
I think this is such a good question. And our next guest is going to help us break that all down. Our next guest is Dr. Leah Lefevre, who is an assistant professor in communication studies at the University of Alabama. She studies interpersonal communication, or how people communicate. And what's really interesting about her research is that she also integrates how technology helps or hinders that interpersonal communication.
That's right. And Leah studies topics that are really relevant for, I'd say college students, but really everyone as I think back on my life. Yikes. She studies phenomenon like ghosting and sexting. And what I think is intriguing is that people actually share their experiences with her. And I think back to my own experiences, and I'm just not sure that I would want to tell a stranger about the experiences I've had with being ghosted. But you know what? Maybe I would. And that's what her research is about, right? Finding out about the experiences people have to create better understanding of the world we live in. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Leah.
Thanks. Appreciate it for having me.
So I'm going to have to fess up to a little bit of social media stalking of you. And I did notice on your Twitter profile that you refer to yourself, and I love this, by the way, you refer as a water exercise fanatic and a devoted dreamer. Those are two things that I love. And so I have to ask, how have the last 11 months that we've been sort of experiencing collectively, how has that changed your water and exercise game and your dreaming? I'm curious, very selfishly, because it's like, oh, I describe myself that way too. What has Leah been doing?
Yeah, it is definitely prohibited going to more, at least ocean bodies, but in the nearby area, I am lucky enough to have a stand-up paddleboard. So I still can get out in the water pretty often, even if it's a little pond nearby or one of the lakes. So I'm lucky in that extent, but it has definitely expanded my dreaming.
Yay.
I was I missed traveling and the good fortune to be able to do that. And just seeing so many people we love that I have often travel with, oftentimes I travel with my parents to different sort of destinations and locations. So lucky enough to do that. And I am dreaming of a short list of all the places I want to go as soon
Nice.
is constrained or controlled.
Well,
yes,
I love that you have kind of reframed the way that we can't do it into the dreaming of times when we can. I think that's really motivating and inspiring.
Thanks.
Definitely.
I think we have to, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yes.
So,
for sure.
Can you tell our listeners briefly about where you're from and kind of a big picture what you do?
Yeah. I'm originally from northern Wisconsin, so that's probably why I love the water so much. So Eagle River, Wisconsin. I went to school at La Crosse for my undergraduate degree. so University of Lacrosse. I majored in communication and political science. From there, I pivoted across the state to go to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. So I have my master's degree there. I took a little stint in the University of Illinois in Charleston, where I taught for a couple of years, figuring out exactly what I wanted to do with my PhD. And then I had the good fortune to go to Texas. So I'm a Longhorn.
All right.
So got my degree there, studied interpersonal communication. And then after that, I was able to move out west to the University of Wisconsin-Wyoming before coming here in 2017 and been here ever since. So
cool.
Well, so to have you follow up on that a little bit, can you give us an elevator pitch of your research and scholarship and kind of how you got started doing what you do?
Sure. Yeah, I definitely. So I look at sort of the intersection between romantic relationships and technology. But one question that sort of geared me towards that, which it kind of expands it slightly, is that I often ask my students, like, what are the most important things to them? And then I make them narrow down, I take their most important things away. And most people end up with being family, friends, and health. And that's really what I study. So sort of the combination of those. And I, of course, overlay a lot of those with how technology has changed and adapted and modified, so sort of how we're interacting and connecting with each other.
Okay, so many follow-up questions. So given the question that I just asked about like what you're doing personally with your dreaming and water and exercise, I feel like the last 11 months have potentially changed so much for people in the way that they connect or don't connect in romantic ways online. Have you done studies recently related to that and kind of how COVID has changed it or opened the door to people who hadn't done it before?
Yeah, that's a great question. I just happened to get a data set the other day. We collected one originally from like a student sample right at the beginning of the pandemic in like February and March, but more recently we've had opportunity to collect more of a diverse sample of people, and we added a question that specifically dealt with COVID, and this was all surrounding sexting behavior. So sort of seeing how things have changed, and one of the questions, we just started looking at it, but to get to your point of like how sort of this has changed, we asked one of the questions like, is it the same? Is it different? Or did it like increase? So increase, decrease, or sort of the same, and then a follow-up qualitatively to sort of see and suss that out. And about like 60% of the sort of like more diverse sample in the US said it was about the same, their behavior. But the more interesting were sort of like the 20% on either side. And the 20% that decreased were like, I'm already spending 24-hour day with my partner. I can't think about sexting them. I have nothing sexy to share. They know everything about And then there's also like, well, we're having more sex than usual and we're together more often. So in a good way, they don't have to do sort of these like intermediate sort of connections. And then on the opposite side, I think you had a lot more like single people and people in long distance relationships or constrained, and they have increased. They're like, I'm looking for connection with people. I'm more amped up than usual because I'm by myself or I'm bored. And then people just like longing and trying to connect with their partners because they're not able to see them.
So let me hop in and ask you, given your findings, I'm going to put you on the spot. Can you come up with like a headline that for this study, given your kind of quick results?
Something like, again, this is just rough. I would say like, sexting's not sexy if I'm seeing you 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
Oh, that's good.
I like it.
Yeah, something like that.
So how did you get started in this specific area of research?
Yeah, so sort of that intersection, like it kind of builds. I was thinking about this when listening to your podcast and the question of like, how to get it interpersonal. I think it sort of started then how to more specifically technology. I remember my first communication class I ever took was interpersonal, and I fell in love with the topic. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I know I wanted to study something with this. And so then I went and got my master's degree. The first day teaching, I had the opportunity to be a TA of interpersonal. I walked home on a cloud all day long. I was like, I get to research and think about this and talk about it. And then when I went to Texas, I had the good fortune of working with the forensics team. And I still remember one of my students who was working on his prose and just practicing it in front of me and doing it. And it happened to be this prose about he was angry his grandpa was friends with his ex-girlfriend on Facebook. I was like, this needs to be studied. And I was talking to a couple of my colleagues that I do a lot of work with, and they had been thinking about similar ideas with technology and just sort of like dissolution and breakups and initiation and just sort of communication. And we've kind of come to this like coalescence. And so that really sort of like pivoted it, like, these are things that are happening day to day, and there needs to be more research with sort of like technology implementing and sort of changing that. And the whole prose was about how angry he was his grandpa for being friends with his ex. That's my.
Oh, that is hilarious.
Yeah. So I think to answer your question more specifically, like just all the things that we're seeing day to day seem to be constant questions I have about like, why isn't that being studied? So then I study it.
Mm-hmm. So I think, I mean, one of the things that I think is so cool about what you're studying is that it's relatable.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, you know, when we're having conversations, whether it's face to face or through this technology, or we see someone else having a conversation, can you talk to us a little bit about like why that's significant? Like, why does it merit research and not just like, oh, I'm going to be angry at my grandpa?
Which you might be able to be angry at your grandpa. But yeah, it is often really relatable, and I think important too, because oftentimes I think we take for granted some of the changes. Like I know lots of times different reviewers and other people suggest like, well, these are the same processes that have always been taking place. And but are they? I mean, even in the pandemic world, right? Like, and doing things in a Zoom, like what you have to do that is fundamentally different, that changes and alters the communication, that makes it not only relatable, but also important and significant. And I think one of the arguments are different. Like, so are we studying the same processes, or how do these adaptations sort of like change that suggest we need to rethink about our communication and our practices?
So, Leah, you had mentioned a few minutes ago that part of what you do is qualitative research. I was wondering if you could explain to our listeners a little bit more about the actual process, because it sounds like you're getting pretty personal information from your study participants. So can you kind of break down the way that you study this just so that people can understand it?
Yeah. So I sort of took like a mixed methods approach most of the time with studies. So meaning I obtain both qualitative and quantitative data, but more often than times, like I've done interviews and focus groups with individuals, but I would say the majority of how data is being collected is surveys. And oftentimes that helps a little with some of the face saving, especially if you're talking about breakups or
right.
or sexting. Some of these things that people aren't going to admit to in a face-to-face setting, though you would be surprised what people are willing to share.
There could be many follow-ups to that.
And so oftentimes asking people about sort of their experiences are really personal. Like you get really people who are dealing with even sort of like mental health issues in association with their breakups or rejections, or their own personal like hang-ups or traits that they're sort of working through and thinking about. And so oftentimes surveys, but with that it could be collegiate samples, lots of times emerging adults like 18 to 29, but then even larger ones thinking about community access to sometimes like grandparents or married couples. So oftentimes using different software sites like Amazon MTurk or Prolific to sort of access some of those people we wouldn't get otherwise.
Okay, so now I have to ask, like, when we think about research, we have this informed consent, right? And your participants often, especially given kind of an online survey nature of a study, are going to see the title of the study first, and then they're going to see like, and I'm going to be asking you about sexting. Or I'm going to be asking you about the last time you were ghosted, or I'm going to be asking you about your last breakup. And how do you have any like tricks or ways that you convince people to share? Or is it just like, yes, please, I want to talk about that time I was ghosted. And I want you to know, because everyone should know about this terrible experience.
Yes. Oftentimes I feel like the names usually have to be, I would say, a little flashy or flirty to get their interest, but it is surprising what people are willing to reveal in an anonymous survey, that there are like personal hangups, situations, things that would like make you maybe potentially cringe, or a lot of stigma associated with it. But people get really personal, and I often find it's sort of cathartic too, sort of shouting into the void, but with a purpose. And so there usually hasn't been as much hang up, especially with sort of the survey in sort of an anonymous way. But when I've had people come and talk about some of their experiences in focus groups, there does seem to be more reluctance to talk about some of those topics, especially if you feel like you're the person who's always ghosting people, or you are perceived as the male sending those sexting images. So there is stigma associated with some of the elements to it. So figuring out the best way to sort of access and get to, but those anonymous surveys, people will reveal all sorts of information, thankfully.
I have a little story to tell you. I have introduced our participant pool to classes. I have used your studies as a way to get people interested, because I think our undergrads often think like, I can't participate in research, or research is boring, and what do I have to share? And so I often ask these like 200 people classrooms, I'm like, have you ever ghosted someone? Have you caught a feeling before? And then they perk up and they're like, oh yeah, I can share this. This is cool. So I think you're right. Like, your area is just, it's accessible to people, and it makes people feel like they want to be heard. And I like so much that you kind of connected that to what's important to people. Because I think that when people feel like they have a story to tell, or their experiences to tell, then they're going to be interested in sharing them.
Yeah, well, thank you for getting participants for me.
Of course.
But yeah, I think that's often the case. Sometimes even my reviewers have revealed themselves in different sort of scholarly ones and signed their names with their own personal story that connected with it.
Wow.
One more recently with a ghosting experience, and talking about the idea of like ambient loss. And this particular viewer signed their name and said they still think about being stood up like 20 or 30 years ago, and how salient and important that was. And they like shared their own story in conjunction with the review.
Wow.
That's amazing. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very surprising. But how powerful it was to them, and sort of like recreating and sort of trying to fill in those pieces. I think people are trying to, reconcile with that uncertainty and unknown.
Sure.
Well,
yeah.
So I have a question sort of related to what you study broadly in terms of interpersonal communication. And when I say this, it's going to make me sound very, very old. But I feel like the way that people connect now in terms of relationship building or the sustaining of relationships, I mean, obviously it's evolved so much with technology. And if you think about, the college students that we're teaching, or the high school students, or even younger, like their quote unquote relationship may largely be through a device, whether it's texting or Snapchatting, or whatever else. Do you feel, and I'm totally putting you on the spot here, but how do you feel the technology, has it improved the interpersonal communication, or are there kind of downsides to it?
Yeah. Lots of times I still try and put the onus and agency on the person, but we know that technology has a lot of built-in mechanisms to perpetuate both good and bad behavior. I would say the complexity associated with it, like, by no means you're dating yourself, and I probably am too, but right, we didn't have some of those things where you were in constant contact and access. all the time, and being able to see sort of impression management on not only alternative partners, but yourself and other people
Mm-hmm.
you're interested in. So I think the amount of information and trying to navigate it is really tricky. In particular, when it's sort of one of the things I sort of hone in on is sort of even privacy and sort of thinking about the difference between their sort of like private and public image and also the permanency they have with that.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things I really try and get my subjects when we study those, but like also like students and stuff to think about it is when you put that image of that relationship selfie up together and then you want to remove it later, what are sort of those implications and who has access to that and what and how is that changing how you feel about your rumination and nostalgia and self-image and adjustment? And so thinking about those. So it is way more complicated, I think, because you have to sort of navigate all those channels sort of simultaneously. And we also suggest that they have the skill set and literacy to do that. When often they may know how to use it, but they don't understand what those implications are and the behaviors that may be healthier for both the present and the future. So I think there are a lot of limitations, but in positive ways, right? With the pandemic, with people, hopefully create, less loneliness, better well-being. But at the same time, it doesn't necessarily negate the importance of sort of that face-to-face connection.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking like right now, like, oh, when did I do that? And how it affected me. So yeah, one of the things that I often tell my students when they're reading articles is that a sign of a good research study is one where you read it and then you come away with even more questions at the end that you want to pursue or just come up. Can you tell us about like a study that maybe you've done where you have come up with even more questions to ask given your results?
Yeah, we're kind of like a couple of my colleagues, I told you I started with some work at Texas. We have a constant sort of like line of research. Every study then creates at least 5 additional studies we want to do. And that's sort of with these artifacts people leave online, or sometimes we call them relics. So like things that you've had from your past relationships. And that could be romantic. That's sort of what we focus on, but it could easily be sort of friendships that no longer exist, or even family members who have like passed away and memorializing them, and sort of thinking about what those are. So some of the studies we've done, we originally started, funny enough, with that pros conversation, the grandpa doing it. We started with dissolution. After you break up, how do you manage sort of these artifacts? What are you removing that's sort of publicly facing, privately facing, but also like, are these intentional? Like do you a deleter, or are you like ordering?
Right, because you can't like throw the clothes out onto the lawn and burn them when it's online, right?
Yeah. And it would feel really good, but how do you virtual space? And so we've sort of started thinking about the idea in association, like how do people like manage these, but then also are these sort of like intrinsic personality traits that regardless of the relationship, that this is just like who they are and how they resonate with ideas and artifacts and items. And then also like how does this transcend into sort of different relationships? Yesterday we were just sort of looking at the idea of like potentially like some of the artifacts we were looking at, women more often keep more items in comparison to men, but then are there differences between initiators and non-initiators in breakups? So like you can see a spiral of questions that have been created about like how people are managing it. Does it matter the sort of relationship? Does it matter who did what in sort of said relationship? And how does this then transcend to other types of relationships?
So something you had said as you were answering this, one of the questions I wanted to ask was, as researchers, at times it can be a lonely process because we're working on something, a study on our own. But you had just referenced other scholars at Texas that you're working with. Can you tell us a little bit about the collaborative process and how it's worked for you and benefited you just in some of your recent studies?
Yeah, I would say I love collaboration. It energizes me being able to even talk to people on Zoom or Skype or whatever sort of format, like several times a week, like just working through an idea together. I actually prefer collaboration. I think it gives you different perspectives and the push and pull that happens, and you have different skill sets that you're all sort of attributing. Oftentimes I work very interdisciplinary. I work with a lot of people in human, family, and development studies, but sort of even cross exchanges there. So collaboration gives me energy to think and pull because all these people have different sort of perspectives. And I've had the good fortune that I built some in grad school, but then even going to conferences and networking, and then even here at the University of Alabama, working with people in the college and across the university of like-minded people who are sort of thinking about and existing in the same spaces. But there's always challenges too. Time, figuring out the time, and how do you also even figure out like time zone changes and orientation, but differences of like, are you more compatible? Are you still working in sort of the same pace? Some people are faster, slower, depending, obviously, even pandemic things. Do I have children? Am I caretaking? Sort of different questions there. But yeah, I've had the good fortune to like kind of had people initiate sort of interactions with me, but outreach to them, and then just kind of seeing that we're working on the same thing. So created a lot of different collaborations.
Nice. So the next question I have is about the application of your work. I mean, like as you're talking, I'm like, ooh, this would be a really good like sitcom. I can just see, like, as you mentioned, like these different personality types and somebody initiating breakups versus experiencing breakups, and I could just see that being so engaging, and someone like, I want to watch this and I want to read every study that's published now, because not only I think it would be, I mean, it could be kind of comical, no lie, but I also feel like I can relate and I could be like, yes, or no, don't do that. But can you talk about kind of where your research lives outside of like a journal article?
Yeah, I love one. I appreciate that. I would be happy to. I know there's a show on MTV. It has some sort of ghosting title, and we did tweet at him at one point, like, if you need a researcher, we are happy to help you.
Ooh.
I think Love Gone Missing, that's the title of it. So some of it exists in other spaces. I really like to try, and the people it affects, so like particularly sort of like students and presenting at conferences to people who are experiencing said things. I think that's really important. I'm a big believer in promoting the next generation and sort of how they're sort of working through these challenges and vocabulary and lexicon and behavior. So getting it back to them. I've also had a couple that have been promoted in like Psychology Today or So Simple. So anytime it can get into larger ones, I would love some sort of shout out in Cosmo or something, right? That
Yes.
that people are reading and digesting it, but with more scientific backing. And then sort of some other spaces. Some of it has also transcended to sort of practitioners or therapists or clinicians who are like implementing and sort of talking to young adults particularly, but anyone dating or working through breakups or trying to initiate. So some of those spaces. And then when I happen to be on a podcast like this, or sometimes on different social medias, you'll probably see with some of my presence. And when you're searching me down, I'm not a big creator of media in comparison, but I think those are all really good to self-promote and sort of get ideas out there that need to be shared.
So shifting gears just a little bit, part of what we have to do as scholars and researchers is this revise and resubmit process. And in many cases, it takes a lot of persisting and a lot of resilience. Can you tell us either about your experience with that and how you stay motivated and positive and don't get frustrated with what a reviewer has to say? Maybe provide encouragement for our listeners.
Yes, I would say persistence. Oh, I would double down on that. It does take that, especially if you feel like the study is sound, important, and is going to like add to the conversation. And I think recognizing the importance behind it yourself will help carry and champion that on, even when others don't see the merit. Like I know, for instance, with some of my ghosting research, as some people have kind of talked about, like I was a little ahead of the curve with it. So I faced a lot of discussion that it wasn't a thing, that this is not a behavior, reviewers weren't familiar with it, that it's just what has always been done. And So knowing if something's really good and important, and of course now there's many studies coming out there which are really exciting, and they don't have to face those same sort of battles, but I mean that probably got rejected at least half a dozen times before finally recognizing like this is important. So facing that battle for several years, but also having collaborators that you can also lean on and commiserate with when you get a rejection.
That's a very fair point.
Are really important. But I think recognizing the merit and the faults and flaws, but also hoping and appreciating that somebody is going to see merit in it, and trying to incorporate some of those review comments from previous, but knowing that not all of them have substantial merit to them.
Mm-hmm. I think that's really encouraging, and it speaks to the fact that you have to not only like believe in what you're researching, but you have to be interested in it yourself.
Yes, 100%. And knowing that like it does have merit, and sometimes you're like, well, this maybe doesn't, and a lot of people poke holes at that, and maybe there's another study that needs to be done to like double down on what's actually there. So kind of taking with a grain of salt, but knowing that I definitely get mad for a few days after every rejection, and then I try and channel that anger in a productive way.
Much like potential other relationships, I think might be a little parallel there.
Definitely.
The next study.
So to kind of wrap this up on a fun note, because you are a dreamer and did reference traveling, one of the all of our guests is about where they've traveled to for conferences, because we do have that good fortune to travel nationally and internationally to present our research. What's one of the favorite places you've visited while traveling to present your research?
Yeah, I love this question. It took me a lot of thought because of all the dreaming about where I go and where I've been. I've had the good fortune, I'd say I think my favorite, and there are many favorites, but Melbourne, Australia.
Oh,
was just delightful. Obviously it took a while to get there, but had the opportunity to stay for a little longer. I went for the International Association of Relationship Research. So interdisciplinary conference that takes place like biannually, and then they have minis between, but it was amazing seeing the city. I got to go on the Great Ocean Road. I got to see little penguins.
oh,
it was amazing. So if anyone has a chance to go to Australia for a conference, they definitely should.
Oh, I love that.
Well, Leah, thank you so much for sharing your experiences as a researcher and a scholar with our listeners. I know I have learned a lot, and I'm motivated by what you have said to kind of have the approach to research that you do. And then I'm also just really excited to get out and read some of your scholarship.
Thank you both so much. I really appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Leah.